Chapter 11. Mother is dead. There isn't anything left of her. I can't feel her in the air, I can't remember her voice, and her house has become cold and quiet. I do not know what to feel. Grief for Steve was dreadful. It was as if I was lost in all ways. I no longer had a place in this world, no longer had a role as a human being, no longer had any reason to exist, except that I did exist, and I kept breathing, but I had followed Steve to a place just past that of living, and not yet into death. If there was a veil between life and death, I had gone so far with Steve as to become entangled with this veil, trying to hold on to him, but having to let him go. Turning back into the world of living was hard. I was enmeshed in a place that felt between the two worlds. I didn't want to die, but I didn't want to go back to my life. I quite simply hurt in my head and heart so badly that nothing came close to helping. I'm not like that for Mum. I don't cry. I don't feel I have no place in the world, and I am not overwhelmed. I am not grief-stricken, but I am bereaved. Life goes on, and people ask me how I am, and I do not know how to reply. Fine, I say, and I wonder if I am fine. I must be. They look at me oddly, as if I should be more affected by loss. I have cried once or twice to very close friends, but apart from that, I don't really know. What I have done is postpone everything until next year. What I want to do is nothing. To hide away and to think. I want to sit in my room at home, wrapped in blankets and secured into a corner of the sofa with cushions, and speak to no one, see no one, and read. I want to think about what I really need, what I really want. But the question I keep coming back to is, who am I now? 6 months from now, had I but known it, I would be travelling to Scotland to be with Dominic for his final days. Our deal was that when he needed me, he would send for me. The call came, and I travelled by train to Edinburgh, arriving at the hospice gates in a thunderstorm and pouring rain. Just before midnight, knocking at the door of the hospice, I felt I was in an Addams Family story, with the rain falling loud and relentless behind me, the thunder crashing, and the lightning showing me as a bedraggled stranger knocking at midnight on the door of the place where dying happens. Going straight to his room and sitting beside his bed, I held his hot, thin hand. "Hello, Dom," I said. "I have come." I am motherless. I am 55 and motherless. I saw my mother out of this world. I kissed her as she died, and all was as it should be. In order to live with her during her final illness, I rented out my own room in my house and became stateless. My house is filled with lodgers. I have been renting rooms in my big old house in Bognor for years. As soon as my children left home, their rooms were filled with people who paid to live here. Over the years, some of these paying guests are part of the family, so renting out my own room was just another room to rent for me. After Mum died, I stayed on in her house for a few more weeks, alone, thinking, comfortable, talking to her as if she was in the air, feeling nothing very much except possibly surprise at how normal it all was. The large oak dining table and chairs came out of the garage back to where they belonged, over the spot in the dining room where Mum's bed had been. At the top of the table, where her head was, where she took her last fragile, invisible breath, I placed a jam jar with white flowers. The flowers were remnants of those left for her by her friends as she lay dying. A few of the flowers were still going, and so they went to mark the spot where she had last lived. Soon they too died, and the jam jar was removed, and nothing was there to mark the spot any more. It didn't really matter. Nothing really mattered, except that I was content and felt no sadness, no pain, and I had no questions. After Steve died, I asked him endlessly where he was. I asked and never received an answer, and sometimes I still ask, but with Mum it didn't matter. Perhaps because she had been such a strong person in her life, perhaps because she was my mother and knew more than me about life and now death, perhaps I simply trusted that she had worked something out about being dead now, and that whatever it was, she was fine with it. But I didn't want to put on her slippers. I didn't want to lie on her bed. Something of the need to remain separate from her remains. I cleaned her house as she would have liked it, and tidied her kitchen so that should she have been able to see it, it would have pleased her. In many ways, perhaps, she was still around. It was impossible to process her being alive, dying, being buried, and being gone forever and ever in a rational way, because what the hell is dying anyway? You know that death happens, and you see it happen, and still it doesn't make any sense. So perhaps Mum could see. If she could, I was doing the right things. If she couldn't see, very soon it would become obvious, and it wouldn't matter even if I held a rock concert in her kitchen. If she couldn't see, then there would be nothing at all left of her, and it would not matter a jot to her what I did, said, or became. At some point, it became time to leave her house and go back to mine. When I had packed my bag, rented out my room in Bognor, and moved into Mother's house, I did not want to consider how I would move back out again. That, at the time, would be after her death, which at the time of moving in was in the air, but still far enough away to be safe. Life goes on. I had to get back to my house and pick up the threads I had left hanging until my mother died. I have made my front sitting room with the piano in it into my bedroom. I have a bed, clothes, a sofa, a chair, and a grandfather clock. The furniture that I cannot use is in the garage, and this sitting room is where I now live. It is my safe space. It is from here I imagine that I will wrap myself in blankets and surround myself with cushions on the sofa while I remove myself from the outside world and go within. Sometimes I do manage it. Mostly I do not. Life goes on. My house needs to be kept going. My sons and daughter need to see me, and I cannot avoid jobs and commitments. I have to pay my bills. My lodgers need rules. My friends need to be told that I'm not coming out to play, and people who ask for work need a courteous response. My father, with his dementia in London, needs help, and my brothers, those siblings whose dead mother is also my mother, we need to talk about what to do next. I think, oh, my brothers will suffer. They loved Mum so much. Oh, I think it will be hard for them. It is not hard for me, but it will be for them. But it seems that they are feeling the same as me. We are not grieving with tears and confusion. We are simply bereaved. We are finding our way through what has happened without feeling that it should not have happened, that it was unfair, and that we were unprepared. When Rafe said that he was feeling relief, we all realised that we were relieved too. A sense of freedom, he said. We nodded. We are feeling that too, we said, and so we are. Our mother was powerful, controlling, and difficult, and we were wary of her anger and her need to control. She was also funny, loving, wise, honest, and clever. she was 85. She knew she was dying and told us that it was fine. But now, with her having done this dying, my brothers and I are left to carry on. We are all asking ourselves who we are now, all of us motherless. We no longer have to face her when the demons are there. We no longer have to worry that she is back in her darkness. I do not have to feel afraid to tell her how I feel, or tell her what I have been doing, and if the blackness was upon her, to risk her scorn and disinterest. When Alexia, my first child, was born, I decided to sit in the new red armchair that Mum had bought for me in which to feed her, and to stay there unmoving in my pyjamas without seeing anyone, without shopping or going outside for 6 weeks. I sat and held this baby girl and retreated from the real world outside. After 6 weeks, I decided that I needed to be on the red chair indefinitely, and stayed there for 3 months. This is how I'm feeling now about Mum. I am in my room, in my blankets, on my sofa, wanting to hide away, to think about Mum's life and what it meant until I can come out. This time, though, instead of planning to go out with my new baby and stirring myself off the red chair, I am already out and about, but planning constantly to go back to my room and hide with my blankets and cushions, back to this equivalent of the red nursing chair. The red chair has just gone to Alexia for her to sit in after the arrival of her first child next month. She will slip into my role as mother, and I will slip into my mother's role of grandmother. My relationship with Mum is better now than it has ever been. I talk to her all the time. I'm very nice to her, and I know what she would say if she was being nice to me, so I reply for her. It is how it should have been when she was alive. There is no anger, and she only says very encouraging things to me. I ask her to help me to make decisions, and I have begun to ask her to help me get work. Go and look after so-and-so, I say to her on hearing that someone is in need. Mum, I say, please let me get a parking space. Or I say to her, what shall I do, Mum? Show me a sign. Tell me what to do. It strikes me that Mum has become a bit of a deity. I am praying to my dead Mum. She would like that, and I feel very grateful to her that she's up there and being so helpful. I met my Mum, I haven't met God, so it's quite nice to make her take up that role, since I already know that in life she really did want the best for everyone, and now that she is dead, she should have extra powers. I have been surprised at how I am not crying. I think about Mum, and then I have to tell myself she's not coming back. She has died, and that means eternity. It's over. This is hard to make sense of, and so I have had to sit down and think, is she really gone? How is it that she can be lost and empty and disappeared? Perhaps I don't think she really has disappeared, since I'm praying to her so much. Twice now she has answered me. The first time was in the week after her death, when I was at the hospital with my older son. He had been admitted with a serious spinal infection and was waiting for a transfer to a spinal unit in London. There was much confusion and much anxiety. He was in a terrible state. He was in great pain and suffering mental and physical distress, and somehow the transfer kept being cancelled, postponed, and simply not happening. Arriving at the hospital and finding that the transfer had once again not happened, and that no one knew when it would happen, or that it may happen at all, I asked Mum in desperation to sort it out. In life, Mum was unstoppably efficient and clear-headed. In an emergency she could and did move mountains. Mum, I said to her under my breath, help me. Inside my mind I heard the words, he's going tonight. Amidst the mayhem within my son's hospital room, it seemed ridiculous, but I had felt the words that he would go tonight and believed it. I said nothing in case he didn't go, and I looked foolish, but I felt relieved. Later that evening, as I arrived at the hospital and walked into my son's room, a nurse rushed in and said that the transfer ambulance was here and he was to pack and go now. We were all very surprised and delighted, and I said a quiet and admiring thanks to Mum, my new deity. The second time Mum answered me was in the run-up to her funeral. Due to the severity of my son's illness, it was impossible to move him, and for him to come all the way down from the centre of London to Petworth in West Sussex to attend the funeral. He was distraught, and plan after plan was tried, all with no success, and I asked Mum to sort it out. The situation was getting out of hand with my son's distress and refusal to accept that he could not move, let alone get in a car and come 3 hours down to the countryside and back again. In my head I heard the words, "It's all taken care of," and I felt instantly calm. It all was taken care of. My son had to accept that he could not come, and by the end of that day, calm had been restored and order prevailed. He could not come. He accepted it, and so he would stay in hospital. We would photograph and record as much as we could for him. Again, I sent Mum a little thank you and wondered what else I could get her to do. I loved my mother. I didn't always like her, but I loved her. She said the same about me, and if I say that I found her difficult, she, poor Mum, found me impossible. From my earliest moments, I believed that I was a fairy. Being a fairy meant that I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do. I needed to dress myself up, and I needed to be admired. But Mum herself was truly beautiful. She had long, waist-length hair, glossy, thick, and blue-black. She wore it wound into an Aubrey Hepburn chignon on top of her head and secured it with big black pins. The back of her head was perfectly round, which I admired greatly, as my own head is flat at the back. Mother had blue eyes, thick black eyelashes and eyebrows, and a small dimple in her chin. She was slim, small, and effortlessly smart and elegant. To me, she was the ultimate in sophistication and glamour. People thought she looked like Elizabeth Taylor. The only thing that was not lovely about her, according to Mum, though I thought it lent her a certain individuality, was her nose. It was large, flat, and wide, with a small lump right at the tip. "Like a ski jump," she would say, and despite telling her that it was a lovely nose, we all secretly agreed. Mother's hands were soft and magical. Holding me when I was ill or upset as a child, her hands felt full of healing and warmth. I remember being soothed by her hands when I was about 5. I must have been crying, and I remember Mother picking me up and stroking my head and hair with those lovely hands. She made a bed on the sofa in our breakfast room and tucked blankets around me, telling me that I had a cold. And when my father came home, I was to tell him I had this cold, and he would be kind to me too. As I lay on the sofa, Mother brought me a tiny plate, one of her pretty china plates with roses round the edge, with minute bite-sized jam sandwiches with the crusts cut off as a treat. This seemed to be the best thing that had ever happened to me. Not only did I have a cold, which sounded extraordinarily important, but I had tiny jam sandwiches on a pretty plate, and my mother was stroking my hair and smiling at me. She was utterly beautiful and kind. I felt truly loved and very important. Not only had I got a cold, whatever that was, I had tiny sandwiches too. I was not a pretty child. I was fat, pink, and full of enthusiasm. I had straight white blonde hair that was tied on top of my head with a pink ribbon. I had attitude. I wore the prettiest dresses that Mother and my dear aunts could make for me, and I loved nothing more than to drape myself in Mother's spare net curtains and best shoes and hold court. If my mother's sole wound was rejection, if her shame was that she had no education, then her fear was that I would suffer as she had done. Her fear was that I would be rejected if I did not conform. She was afraid that people would laugh at me unless I knew how to behave, and that there were rules in order to protect me from not fitting in. My lovely, beautiful mother understood the value of things and knew how to find real quality in all the things she owned. She had struggled all her life with the lack of space, money, and opportunity in her own home. She had a fine and deeply intelligent mind, and knew that life was filled with poetry, books, clever people, and a better way of living. It was something she aspired to, and my father had it. He was born to it, and she had married him believing that now she would have a way into it too. But her soul wound of rejection made it impossible to believe that she could belong in this world of beauty and fine thinking. She could play her part in public, but in private she was traumatized by self-doubt and insecurity. Inside the beautiful Maureen Rolls was always the shy, forgotten, malnourished and bleak little 9-year-old Maureen Jarvis that went to Ireland to live with her aunt. As the years went on, she became less and less able to play the part that she longed to play, that of belonging to and feeling equal with those to whom education and privilege were a given. It was a huge factor in bleakness of her breakdown, the loss of her marriage, and the recurring darkness that scarred and damaged not only herself, but my father, my brothers, and myself. I, on the other hand, preferred the chaos, the mayhem, the fun, and the chips at my mother's family home with my Irish grandmother and English grandfather, whose pockets were always full of chocolates. I was a fairy. I was interested in eating. I didn't understand any of my mother's fears, and I wanted to do my own thing all the time. Grandad, my mother's father, worked for Cadbury's in Bourneville and Birmingham, and had access to a never-ending supply of failed bar sixes, failed cream eggs, and failed fruit and nut. It was heaven. There was also a mountain, Grandad told us, of toffee waste in the factory, into which the surplus Brazil nuts were thrown. When it hardened and cooled, Grandad and the other employees could chip large chunks off them and take them home in brown paper bags. I didn't like the nuts, but the toffee was brilliant. I could spit out the nuts and make myself sick on the toffee. From the very beginning, Mother and I fought about what I should wear and how I should look. My lovely dresses, pretty shoes, and hair ribbons were perfect, but I needed more. I wore sheets, curtains, tablecloths, and I did not understand what her pet problem was. Fairies did this. They wore these things. I felt that my mother did not approve of what I was, and I fought against it as a child until, possibly, the day that she received her terminal diagnosis and did not want to fight anyone anymore. By that time, we had long since stopped fighting with words. We had a truce, and I had grown up and become whatever it is that I had become, and Mother understood that I was never going to be a better version of her. As a child, I loved my mother, but I was naughty. I didn't care for rules, and I didn't understand her need to conform. I didn't care about learning. I didn't stick to piano lessons. I hated tennis, and I didn't like good little girls as friends. When I think of my mother's passion for education, how hard she and my father worked to send all of us to boarding schools to have more learning by the time we were 12 that mother had ever had access to in her whole life, I am ashamed now that I took it all so utterly for granted and didn't care more. I am also deeply grateful that she enabled me to take my exams and go to university and get, somehow, my degree. When I wrote my dissertation for my master's, Mother was so proud and spent ages finding someone to type it up for me so that it looked perfect. I was fiery, creative, artistic and contrary. Mother knew how bad it could be to have no prospects, to have no money, and to not fit in. Mother knew how hard it was to get into the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford with no education or schooling behind her. As time went on, Mother's distress at my lack of interest in being a good girl seemed to blend in with her increasing sadness in general, and with this, the excruciating downward spiral of her marriage to my father exacerbated her dark and frightening moods. I remember one Christmas when I was about 8, Mother sitting on the floor by the tree wrapping presents. She had her long blue-black hair down in the evening, and her kind hands were wrapping up and tying strings on presents. She was crying quietly, and I knew that my father had made her cry, but instead of wanting to make her feel better, I was angry with her. Why would she just sit there and cry? Why wasn't she going to stop him? Why did my mother sit and cry instead of making everything better? Perhaps he was right, I thought. Perhaps she deserved to cry. But I was alarmed, and I didn't like that my father wasn't there saying that he was sorry. I didn't know where he was, and all of this seemed wrong. I didn't want her to cry. She was my mother, and she shouldn't cry. Most of all, whatever it was, I blamed her for it. It has been over 3 months since my mother died. I wonder that I am so calm and peaceful about it. Sometimes I feel a little wave of panic that she isn't here. Mostly, I feel that at some point everything will make enough sense for me to explain it, to describe it to everyone. I have taken time off with her death in September until January next year in order to be silent and let myself feel whatever it is I do feel about Mum. But what I feel is mostly nothing. I have all this time off, and I love the idea of the freedom it should give me, and still nothing is clear to me. Mum has died, and I don't know what I am feeling, if anything. And I'm still very busy. I'm all over the place. In the months after Steve died, I got into my car and drove vast distances to see friends. I was compelled to be a long way away from home and to keep moving. Mum said to me at the time that I was running away from his death and that I should stop all this frantic travelling. I thought she didn't understand. I thought I had to see these friends and that it wasn't my fault that they lived so far away. In retrospect, she was right. I was over the top. I didn't think I was reacting much to his death, but when I look back to that time, I was overreacting. I was never here for my children. I didn't ask them how they were. I didn't even notice them. I was too busy driving long distances across country to see people I felt compelled to see, who may not, now I think about it, have felt quite the same compulsion to see me. Just after Alan's death, and 6 months after Dominic died, and a year after my mother, I retreated into Alan's house, closed the door, and intended to hide away forever, not speaking to anyone for the rest of my life. I remember looking out of the window of his sitting room with the view over the green to his beloved tennis club and seeing his friends and neighbours looking worried and glancing at the house. Everyone knew I was in there, newly widowed, and yet no one had seen me at all. I made a decision then to take the whole year off and hide away. After 2 months of complete isolation, I returned to my own house and began my year off. Mother's house stands empty. The grass is growing tall around it, and there is an air of silence and emptiness. Inside, her shoes are lined up ready for her to wear in the garden. Notes in her handwriting are in the kitchen and on her desk in the conservatory, and the books she was reading are open on the windowsills with scraps of paper in them to keep her place. Her toothbrush is in the mug in her bathroom, the toothpaste only half used. On the pillow of her bed I have placed a small photo of her and a prayer from her funeral. I wouldn't sleep in that room, but one of my brothers has. I say hello to her when I go in to see that everything is clean and secure, and I go into the dining room where the table has been returned to its rightful place after the bed that Mum was in was taken away. Over the spot where she died, I give her a little wave of my hand and ask her how she is. It feels odd to be doing this, and it feels better to do it than not to do it. There is always a chance that she can see me and that her spirit has lived on.